Hey everybody, this is Mr. Hofer, and today we are going to continue talking about FDR and his New Deal as an extension of what we covered in our last segment. In the last segment, we talked about the first 100 days of Roosevelt and his policies that he quickly enacted to bring about relief and some recovery from the Great Depression. As we mentioned in the last video, many of these policies accomplished multiple objectives, both in relief, recovery, and reform. But the focus of today's lesson is going to be on actions taken by Roosevelt during those 100 days and then after that really focused on reforming American law in a way that had not been seen before, or at least if the United States had flirted with these types of reforms, it was to a much lesser degree than Roosevelt implements in his tail end of his first term and moving on into his second. So the first reform that I want to address here with Roosevelt was the reform in response to what New Dealers felt was one of the root causes of the Depression itself, which was the speculation and poor investment practices on Wall Street. As we mentioned in the beginning of the first video, a lot of Americans got into the stock market for the first time using cheap and easy credit by buying stocks on the margin. And really, stock investment was like almost like a casino game in which people were not always informed of the honest facts about a company they were investing in. Instead, speculators, stockbrokers, and entrepreneurs would push a stock and really exaggerate the value of a stock or the success of a stock in order to get investors. So one of the reforms we see Roosevelt making in his first term are reforms concerning investments and securities. So the passage of the Truth in Securities Act is going to require by law that those peddling stocks, whether you're a stockbroker or you're a corporation trying to get investment, if you're pushing an investment, a stock investment, you are required by law to present sworn, accurate information about the soundness of a stock, a bond, and the company in which a potential investor would be placing their money. Now, if you today go and want to invest in stocks or bonds, you're going to have to fill out some paperwork, and part of that paperwork is going to say that the value of a stock is dependent on the market and that your money is not secured like it would be in a savings account. So do read the small print. That print is there because of past experiences. And while you're much safer today investing in the American stock market game, some of those same hazards still do exist, especially if you're not aware of what it is you're investing in. Number two, the Securities Exchange Commission, or the SEC, which becomes the law enforcement agency of Wall Street. And really what we're looking at here is the federal government placing a watchdog over the financial markets and making sure that things like insider trading, speculation, making big runs and then dumping a stock before news is official about how a stock is going to appreciate or depreciate. All of that now is regulated by federal law, and the SEC is the enforcement agency the government operates. You can ask Bernie Madoff or Martha Stewart, some of these famous people that have gotten in trouble with insider trading or Ponzi schemes. The people that come knocking at their door are federal agents associated with the SEC. So New Dealers are determined to reform those money changers and make sure that the kind of mismanagement that at least in part led to the Great Depression, isn't repeated. Of course, opportunists are always going to find a way around the rules, and we continue to not have a perfect system as far as that is concerned. The next major area of reform I want to discuss is public utilities. Now, we all use public utilities, things like water and electric, oftentimes in cities, waste management and that type of thing are public corporations or publicly run businesses. They might have a public board that manages those businesses and sets the prices and is responsible for getting the utility or the product out to the general public. In the 1920s and prior, public utilities, especially electricity and water and sewage and that type of thing, was not regulated by any real level of the government. And so they were run by private companies like Daniel Insull's electric company. And Insull would go and he would buy up the electrical companies of large parts of the Midwest, and he'd place his name on it and really not invest much in the company itself, but regulate the prices, create a monopoly on power, really take advantage of the fact that electricity is now becoming not just a novelty of Thomas Edison's day, but a necessity that people depend on. Well, think about your cell phone. Okay, today we're kind of in the same area with our cell phone service. Everyone has a cell phone, and we're more likely to say that cell service is a necessity and not just a nice luxury item, right? But Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, man, they jack the prices up for data, right, and internet usage. And we're kind of at the mercy of paying whatever it is that they want so that we are able to access that necessity. Well, in the Great Depression, new dealers are looking at the exploitation of public utilities and saying, this is wrong. Something's got to change. And so reforming public utilities becomes a standard in the Roosevelt administration. This is especially frustrating because so many power companies are benefiting from public domain. They are managing electricity produced by dams on the nation's river systems, or their buildings are constructed tax-free on public land. And so for a private company to be exploiting the public trust and then pinching people's pocketbooks, that seemed wrong. And so Congress passes the Public Utility Holding Company Act of 1935. But the thing I really want to focus here on is one of the most revolutionary, far-reaching, we might say, socialist elements of the New Deal, which is the creation of the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was a planned economy for the Tennessee Valley. And you can look at the map here. The Tennessee Valley covers most of the state of Tennessee and western Carolinas, northern Alabama and Georgia. The river systems that run through there, especially the Tennessee River, are taken and improved by the federal government. Waterways are carved out. The land is improved and revitalized. Floodplains are mapped and flood relief is provided. And then those areas were especially important to producing hydroelectric power. Okay. And the Tennessee Valley Authority then would measure what its region's energy consumption was, what the bottom dollar for energy production was, and then really use that as a yardstick to see if power companies across the United States were treating citizens fairly. So we've got the Tennessee Valley Authority producing power and really not selling it at a profit, but selling it as a way for the public good in the public interest, and then saying to private companies, look, you need to basically be on parity with the Tennessee Valley Authority, or you're looking at an issue with the Commerce Department and perhaps a monopoly or trust issue that would be prosecuted under previous progressive laws that we've talked about already. And so this is a planned economy. The government running an institution, not for profit, but for public good, and then using that public option to keep private options in tow. What does that sound like? I'm hoping you think that that sounds a lot like the debates we're having over healthcare. The healthcare reforms that took place under President Obama got dubbed Obamacare. In the early days of trying to figure out Obamacare, one of the options that the president wanted to accomplish was to create a public option. So a public healthcare option that would compete with private healthcare options. And that was cut late in the bill's trip through Congress. And so ultimately what we ended up with was private options only, managed and kind of regulated by the public government. But we continue to consider whether or not a single payer healthcare system or a government option wouldn't be more effective, beneficial to the health and security of all Americans. Now, that's highly debatable. I'm not going to answer that question for you, but we can definitely see some parallels there. So the creation of the Tennessee River Valley Authority is that you're going to have jobs in engineering this big network of rivers and hydroelectric dams. So increased employment, cheaper electric power. The Tennessee Valley Authority also created public housing for workers, so low-cost housing. The sediment that had been harvested in these river systems was then sold for its nitrates value, which nitrates are used in fertilizer, fixing areas that had been eroded by unmanaged river systems so that they're open for farming, reforestation, and other kinds of conservation activities, as well as engineering flood control to make the Tennessee Valley area modern and habitable for citizens of the United States. I like this graph too. This is the percent of Americans that had access to electricity. And you can see that beginning in the 1920s, only about 30% of Americans had electricity in their homes. And by the time we get to the end of the 1930s, we've gone through the Depression and some of these reforms, well up towards 80% of Americans have electricity in their homes. You may be able to still find someone in your family that's alive and well that remembers when their home was first fitted with electricity. Housing continues to be a reform issue for the Roosevelt administration, and I don't want to talk long about this, but the creation of the government agency, the Federal Housing Administration, or the FHA, is worth noting because many of you someday will be first-time home buyers, and you'll be looking for loans to help you purchase your first home. And FHA loans are low-interest, subsidized government loans to help people who, are trying to get a start in life purchase their American dream through home ownership. Here's the biggest of all the Rooseveltian New Deal reforms, the Social Security Act of 1935. For your natural life, you will pay taxes to the US government. And one of the biggest taxes, one of the biggest chunks of change that comes out of your paycheck will be Social Security. And what Social Security is, it's insurance. It's an insurance policy for the old age as well as uh, unemployment insurance. So if for some reason you were to end up on unemployment, that money in part is drawn from federal and state funds. But on top of that, you're also accumulating what's called a retirement pension, or this savings plan for you when you get to a certain age and you've worked so many years. Let's say right now, 65 years old. And the real motivation behind creating the Social Security Act, number one, was to protect this class of Americans who were struggling to put food on the table or struggling to make ends meet, and yet they are aged and they're tired and they're not in their best working condition. And number two, to create job opportunities for younger Americans to move out the older generation so they can rest and enjoy their golden years, and to create new job opportunities for younger able-bodied Americans in the workplace. Now, Social Security will also provide some protections for people that are deemed to be disabled, or should a Social Security recipient die before they receive their pension, that pension will pass on to their dependent children. So, for example, when my dad passed away, I have a 16-year-old sister, and his Social Security benefits were used then up until she was 21 as supplemental income and child support kind of thing for her. So really using tax revenue to provide security for the most vulnerable individuals in society. The big reform in labor comes through the Wagner Act. Congress, again, overwhelmingly Democrat prior to 1936, pass the Wagner Act. And the Wagner Act is really going to solidify labor rights to organize and to choose individuals to negotiate collectively on their behalf with company management. So some factories allowed for collective bargaining. They would negotiate with the workers, but they wanted to pick the representatives for the workers to act as the negotiators. In this case, laborers can pick their representative body, and that body then is the rightful legal representative in negotiating contract issues like wages and work hours and benefits, so on and so forth. Labor organizers considered the Wagner Act the Magna Carta, or the Grand Charter of labor rights in the United States. And it is going to lead to the mass organization of unskilled laborers. The creation of the Committee of Industrial Organization, later known as the Congress for Industrial Organization, same acronym, CIO, became a negotiating body for unskilled laborers. It would have political friction with the AFL, Samuel Gomper's American Federation of Labor. They end up kind of trying to share the same pie, so to speak. But you'll read about in this chapter or see pictures of members of the CIO participating in one of the most novel forms of protest, the sit-down strike. And what the sit-down strike did that traditional strikes didn't was prevent scabs from taking and filling positions that were left open by striking workers. So through the CIO, we have unskilled laborers, especially in automotive industries and in steel industries, taking to the sit-down strike to protest and challenge for higher wages during the Great Depression. Ultimately, the actions of the CIO and other labor groups under the Wagner Act is the passage of even more protections like the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. This sets a federal minimum wage and work week. So the 40-hour work week becomes federal law in any business that operates across state lines at 40 hours. The minimum wage in 1938 is set at 40 cents per hour. So the 40-40, can you imagine today as we discuss whether or not a livable wage is $15 an hour? 40 cents an hour seems just like a pittance, doesn't it? Now, this particular set of laws would not apply to those working in the agricultural, service, and domestic work industry. So what I mean by that is people working in the field, people working different kinds of service jobs today. One of the most common service jobs is like fast food, or domestic workers. So for example, servants and maids and house cleaners and that type of thing. They were not protected by minimum wage or maximum working hours, which meant many African Americans, Mexican Americans, and women were not protected by the Fair Labor and Standards Act. We get to 1936, Roosevelt's re-election comes fairly easily. Republicans really challenged Roosevelt on one issue, and that is that his first campaign promise to balance the budget seems like a lie, or at least very misguided. And so they chide him as being a big deficit spender, and they say the D in FDR stands for deficit. Roosevelt will try in his second term to balance the budget and then give up on that very quickly, and I'll talk about that here in a second. But he goes against a senator from Kansas by the name of Landon, and Landon really depends on former President Herbert Hoover to lead the charge against all of this new social spending and New Deal policies. In the end, it's a trouncing. Landon wins Maine and Vermont. He gets 8 electoral votes to Roosevelt's 523. Roosevelt forms what's known as the Roosevelt Coalition. He brings together political interests, people who previously had very little to do with one another or saw very little similarly as far as politics were concerned. For example, Southerners become predominantly Democratic. African Americans give up the party of Abe Lincoln. Traditionally, up till FDR, African Americans, when they voted for the Republican Party because it was the party of Lincoln. After Roosevelt, blacks vote Democrat. The poor start gravitating towards the Democratic Party, as well as urbanites, whether that is liberal urbanites or, in this case, more likely to be new immigrants, especially Catholics and Jews, who were given a seat at the table in the Roosevelt administration. So after the election of 1936, Roosevelt is feeling like he has a mandate to continue with his New Deal policies. He trounced his competition. The Democrats hold a supermajority in Congress, controlling 2/3 of Congress in both houses. And really, he feels as though the mandate by the American people is to continue moving in a direction of reform, uh, recovery, and relief. So the one area of government that really has been a stumbling block for Roosevelt to this point is the U.S. Supreme Court. We talked about the Schechter case, the sick chicken case, where the Supreme Court found that the government had crossed a constitutional line by deferring legislative action over to the executive branch through the National Recovery Act, the NRA. We've also discussed how the Supreme Court trimmed back certain parameters in Roosevelt's agricultural bills. Indeed, out of the 9 different lawsuits that were brought against the Roosevelt administration and made their way to the Supreme Court, 7 of those overturned the progressive action of the New Deal. And so Roosevelt has a bone to pick with the U.S. Supreme Court. And because of the outcome of the election, he feels that he is mandated then to make some judicial reforms as well. So I'm including this this court controversy as part of his reforms because this certainly was breaking away from the precedent of separated branches of government and checks and balances that had existed to this point. So what Roosevelt looks to do is to ask Congress to give him permission to add 1 new justice to the Supreme Court for every member of the Supreme Court that is over 70 years old. That would have been a total of 6 additional justices, bringing the grand total of U.S. Supreme Court justices to 15, from 9 to 15. His reasoning is that these men that have been appointed to Supreme Court seats and are in their 70s are incredibly conservative, and that there needs to be this new lifeblood in the court system that reflect New Deal interpretations of the Constitution. It's a blind power grab. It really is one of the biggest political miscalculations of Roosevelt's career, and it almost instantaneously dries up the well of political support Roosevelt has from a bipartisan society. Even members of the Democratic Party are a little bit appalled by this court packing plan. So in the meantime, while Congress is mulling this over and critics are calling the president to task about this power grab to add court positions to the Supreme Court, what's seen then in the 9 justices that are on the court is a change in the direction in which they take New Deal cases. For example, the Supreme Court supports a minimum wage standard for women, which overturns a decision that they had made just the year prior, in which domestic workers were not entitled to minimum wage protections. Additionally, they defended the National Labor Relations Act and the Social Security Act as constitutional. And so this increases the criticism of Roosevelt as having taken a blind power grab. It undermines his efforts to get support for packing the courts. And it looks like Roosevelt will not get this one progressive reform, except time will unpack the court for Roosevelt. Like I said, the people that he wants to negate are these older, more conservative justices. Well, Congress passes through a retirement plan for federal court justices, and that gets a couple of the guys to retire. and a few of them die while on the bench. And so in his first term, Roosevelt had replaced 0 Supreme Court justices. In the midst of his second term, he'll have selected someone to replace all 9. So he goes from this court that is heavily conservative, he has no influence over, to making one of the biggest political blunders of his life and demanding more seats, to not needing those new seats because the justices die or retire, and he gets to pick their successors anyway. The final step here that we need to talk about is whether or not the New Deal actually was successful. So I've already alluded to the fact that the first term that Roosevelt serves will not banish the Depression. It makes a dent in the severity of the Great Depression. For example, unemployment drops from 25% to 15%, which is still incredibly high. Even in our Great Recession of 2008, 2009, unemployment never got as high as 15% nationwide. In some states, it was as bad as 12%, but still reasonably lower. The economy continued to operate at Depression levels as we moved into the first year of Roosevelt's second term. And just as the country was seeing some marginal improvement in economic measures, the passage of the Social Security Act and the new taxes that would be needed to fund it stifled economic growth. So conservative critics of Roosevelt would call the recession the kind of the recoil of 1937, the Roosevelt recession. Here in this picture, you can see the Roosevelt recession as we get into 37 and 38. Steeper taxes and pretty much job saturation meant that America's progress was going to be somewhat stifled. Roosevelt also turned towards trying to keep his first campaign promise, which was to balance the US budget. When that was clearly not going to be possible, Roosevelt transitioned to a new economic policy that had become popular amongst economics called Keynesian economics. Now, that comes from the name of the economist John Maynard Keynes, who promoted this idea that governments can prime the pump. I'm going to use that as a figure of speech, that governments can prime the pump of an economy by deficit spending. That governments, as long as they are consistent in repaying their debts, can actually benefit from spending into the hole. And so this is what we would call stimulus spending. And the idea is that if a government, kind of like Hamilton suggests, spends money and establishes a line of credit, not only does that money infuse the economy with fresh fuel, but it also builds the nation's credit, it builds people's trust in the establishment again, and it can pull a nation out of recession. So Roosevelt very quickly in his second term does an about face away from this idea of balanced budgets and moves towards this new orthodoxy of Keynesian economics. So here is John Maynard Keynes, who is an economist, sitting down with the big financial bigwig, Secretary of Treasury Henry Morgenthau, another one of Roosevelt's trusted advisors. On the whole, between the court packing scandal, Roosevelt's about face on deficit spending, as well as a continued growth of support for Republicans in Congress, Roosevelt in his second term loses popularity. He is moving into the realm of what most presidents experience, kind of a stagnation in his influence in guiding progressive reforms. It appears that perhaps he has petered out, for lack of a better term. Without World War II, this might have been the end of Roosevelt's story. We could have gotten to the election of 1940, and Roosevelt and his policies could have made him a lame duck. But we'll never know that, because through the Progressive Era and as a consequence of World War II, we're going to see Roosevelt rise up as a leader of foreign policy as well, which is something we will talk about in our next series. Critics are going to claim that Roosevelt was a communist, that the New Deal was pinkifying, basically bleeding red Soviet policies into the nation's economic system, and that New Deal policies were good examples of government waste, incompetence, corruption. People will be incredibly anti-Semitic and claim that Roosevelt was influenced by Jewish and communist political and economic philosophies. They'll point to programs like the Conservation Corps as examples of government waste. We've talked pretty thoroughly about what kinds of criticisms could be lodged at his policies. On the whole, the national debt between 1932 and 1939 more than doubles. And we can see here, 1932, when Roosevelt was elected, the national debt was under $20 billion. By the time we get to 1939, the last year of his second term, we're at 40 billion. Boy, wouldn't it be nice to go back to the time when our nation's debt was only 40 billion. Anyway, criticisms that the Roosevelt administration would ignore states' rights, and pointing towards these unprecedented moves like the court packing as examples of Roosevelt's intention on becoming a dictator, or some kind of monarch as was rising in Europe, seem to have some justification. The biggest critique that really just can't be shaken is that for the $20 billion poured out over the first term and a half of Roosevelt's presidency, the Depression continued to exist. The United States continued to produce surpluses that kept wages and prices low. There was greater farm surplus in the day of Roosevelt than had been under Hoover, and people continued to feel the economic pinch in a very personal and powerful way through 1939. Your book says that what the New Deal offered for conservatives was a sea of administrative red ink and band-aids and sedatives instead of real economic life-saving policies. Those that view Roosevelt as a hero will point out to the fact that the New Deal was not meant to be an economic curative, but meant to provide relief in the depths of the worst economic crisis our country has ever faced, and that it did accomplish that the impact on humans has to be measured beyond dollars, and that the economy was prevented further collapse through Roosevelt's measures, that there was an increase in economic equality, and that most importantly, but not really something that you can calculate with numbers, is that citizens were able to regain a sense of self-respect, that the New Deal wasn't some kind of communist dole handout, but that it provided a hand up to people who wanted to be self-sufficient by giving them a job and providing them purpose in a time of massive unemployment. Additionally, it could be said that Roosevelt was a moderate choice compared to a lot of the demagoguery that was being seen in Europe, in fascist countries like Italy and Germany. An interview with the head of the American Socialist Party showed that the socialists felt that Roosevelt had destroyed their entire objective for the United States, that what Roosevelt was doing was nothing close to sufficient. And so he was critiqued by radicals on both sides. And so Roosevelt offers this middle road that preserves capitalism, preserves democracy, preserves American financial institutions like the banks and Wall Street, preserves major private industries like the automotive industry and the iron or the steel producing industries, and that really the national debt that we see during Roosevelt's administration, the $40 billion of national debt in 1939, is nowhere near the amount of debt that we're going to incur fighting World War II. And so the total cost of New Deal policies is relatively modest in comparison to other expenses that we have on the horizon in order to become the most important figure in the course of World War II. So I'm going to leave you with this pro-FDR cartoon here depicting Roosevelt as an optimistic captain of a ship that has sailed through its stormiest days. The deck is still wet, and detractors are frustrated and upset about the hardships that they've faced, and clearly are complaining that Roosevelt hasn't done enough. But if you look in the background, the American people whose vision is set further down the horizon are starting to experience the sunshine of recovery. The past, the darkness of the past seems to be behind them. But this, at least by the opinion of this political cartoon, would not have been possible without Roosevelt steering the boat. Next time, we will take a look at Roosevelt's second major impact as he tries to navigate the United States through turmoil in Europe and World War II.